Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Christopher Paolini.
Hi there, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell me about what you've written?
Well, I got my start fairly young. My first book. I'm sorry, I have to apologize. I just got back from book tour on Sunday, and my brain is still like 3 states away and 4 time zones, so it takes me a little while to get up to speed.
Oh my goodness, I completely understand.
No, so I'm best known for my first novel, which is Eragon, classic fantasy novel of young hero, magic sword, dragon, evil villain, all that good stuff. I wrote the sequels to that, which is known as the Inheritance Cycle. So it's Eragon, Eldest, Brissinger, and Inheritance. The last one came out in 2011, so a long time ago now. And following that, I felt like a change of pace. So I moved on to science fiction, and I wrote a gigantic science fiction novel by the name of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which I'm very fond of that book. That came out 2020. And then this year, I have 2 books coming out in 1 year, which is actually a first for me.
Congratulations. That's a huge deal.
On May 16th, I had Fractal Noise come out, which is it's a prequel to Sleep in a Sea of Stars. It doesn't share any of the characters or, it's more of a standalone, but it takes place 23 years before To Sleep. And then this November 7th, I have my newest full-length entry into the World of Eragon publishing, and that's Murtagh. And again, that comes out November 7th. And as my publicist keeps reminding me to say, it is available for pre-order.
Ooh, all right. Well, anyone listening to this, make sure to pre-order and buy all of those books. That's also cool. It's so exciting. I know I was just saying this a second before we started, but I read Eragon and I was completely obsessed with it. I'm so excited to be talking with you here today. So what was it like making that switch from fantasy to science fiction?
It really wasn't as difficult as you might think, because so many of the skills that you build writing fantasy or science fiction are applicable to the other genre. In many cases, they're both genres of imagination, of speculation. So, the world building skills that I acquired working on the Inheritance Cycle applied equally as well to the sci-fi side of things. The 2 things that I found were different were, and this is just because of how I chose to write science fiction. This wouldn't necessarily apply to someone else's sci-fi story. For me, though, the 2 big differences were the vocabulary, since my sci-fi is set in the future, and I allowed myself to use a modern vocabulary, which I really enjoyed because I hadn't been able to do that in the fantasy. Mm-hmm. And then some of the scientific technological restrictions, which I didn't have to pay attention to, but I wanted to, and so that really did put some hard limits on how fast the characters could travel in their spaceships, what the spaceships were capable of. And I really enjoyed digging into that minutia in my own research, although I really tried not to dump it on the readers. But by doing that research, it gave me some interesting story ideas I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Can you tell me a bit about that research process for it? Did you start with that, or did that come about as you were already writing the book?
I already had the story idea for To Sleep and also Fractal Noise, but I didn't allow myself to write either one until I had done a lot of the world building. Because the thing with sci-fi and fantasy is you have to understand the things that are different from our world before you can really, do it justice. And in fantasy, that's usually magic, as well as the society, of course. But magic determines what is or isn't possible. And in sci-fi, it's the technology that determines what is or isn't possible. And since that affects everything, like, do you have faster than light travel? Okay, how fast is it? How does it work? Can it be used for any other, does it have any other knock-on uses, whether that's communication or weaponry, what have you? Do you have AI? I don't actually in my sci-fi universe for various reasons. What kind of weaponry do you have? How do your spaceships shed their excess heat? Can they shed their excess heat? If not, they start cooking after a couple shots of high-powered lasers and missiles and all that. So I did an entire year, almost a year and a half of research, just trying to get myself up to speed on all the things I needed to understand to write these books in this setting, which I call the Fractalverse. And probably the biggest stumbling block was trying to find a system of faster than light travel that didn't contradict physics as we know it, since the Fractalverse includes the real world and all of known history. So doesn't contradict physics as we know it, doesn't allow for time travel, which Einstein says, you travel faster than light, you got a time machine, and hadn't been used by some other sci-fi franchise previously. And that was a really, really tall order, and I had to bang my head against a wall for months and months and months before I started to find some ideas that I could use that other people hadn't used.
That's really quite fascinating. Did you have a similar process? I mean, it's fantasy, so I'm sure it's more your creation as opposed to some of the scientific research, but when you were writing the inheritance cycle?
No, I didn't, although I put a fair bit of thought into the story itself of the inheritance cycle, and then some general stuff as to the society and just kind of, where things were in the world before writing it. I put a little bit. It was more than a little bit. I put a medium amount of thought into the magic system before I started writing, and then as I wrote, the implications of it became much more apparent to me, and I really sort of dove deep into it. In retrospect, were I to create a fantasy series from scratch now, or a fantasy world, I should say, I would really put a lot of attention into that magic system and the society beforehand, just to have a good feel for that before I even start chapter one. And I would put more restrictions on the magic too. I think the more restrictions, the more interesting, even more the more realistic in some ways.
Aside from that part of it, what sort of things have you learned just as a writer? Because you were quite young when you wrote the inheritance cycle.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I could write a book on it. um,
I would read it. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people that would read that.
well, give me a few more years to keep learning, because I feel like I'm still have a lot to learn. I don't know. I've learned a ton about story structure, and I feel like that's something I'm still really working to master. I've learned a lot about writing in a technical sense, just line by line writing. Um, means of using poetic techniques, pacing, structure, all sorts of things like that. So when I started out, if I wanted to write a romantic scene or a scary scene or a tense scene, I might have been able to do it, but my hit to miss ratio was a lot higher, a lot lower. So my odds of actually pulling off what I was trying to pull off were lower. Now I'd say I have pretty good odds. Even if I don't get all the way there in the first draft, I'm usually 80% of where I want to be in the first draft. So that's been a big learning lesson, learning experience. And then the other thing I'd say would be learning that revision and changes and editing are a natural part of the process, and that they don't make you a bad writer. Not engaging with what needs to be fixed will make you a bad writer. But just because you write a clunky sentence or paragraph or chapter or scene or storyline or even a first draft doesn't make you a bad writer, unless you can't or won't fix whatever's going on.
That is incredible advice. I'm still trying to learn that. I know so many writers who have had that exact problem. Like so many of my peers and everyone in
Yeah.
like in classes and everything. That's something that comes up so frequently. So thank you for addressing that.
Well, it's hard too, because getting the let's say you write something that doesn't work. You might sense it, but you may not be able to put your finger on it as the author yourself, because you're so close to the material, or you don't have the experience that you need with whatever the problem happens to be. That's where a good editor can really save your bacon. And
Mhm.
if you're not a published author and you don't have a professional editor on call, then you need to find someone in your life, whether that's a friend or a family member, or even you hire someone who can help read your work and give you some give you some good feedback. And the difficulty with that too is writing subjective. So one person reads a book and goes, "Man, it dragged like it took forever to read this book." And then their friend reads the book and goes, "Oh, I finished that in 3-4 hours. I couldn't put it down. It was awesome." So that also makes it hard to judge the input you're getting.
Who was that for you when you first started writing? Since you were self-published at first.
Yeah, it was my parents and my sister, my close family. Also, my grandmother was dean of arts and sciences and a professor of comparative literature, so she gave me some very high level comments.
Oh,
But mostly it was my parents, neither of whom have any professional. Well, back then they didn't have any professional experience with this. It was just they were smart people who did a lot of reading, and they both liked sci-fi and fantasy, which helped.
that's so cool. And I know you were homeschooled too. Did that background influence the way that you write and like and your access to your parents as a sounding board?
Uh, I mean, I don't know how much it influenced the way I write. I mean, definitely it gave me the chance to write because I graduated from high school early, and thus I had the time to write. But I mean, I think my actual daily process is not so different from other authors. That said, I was very close to my parents, and again, actually being homeschooled allowed me to graduate early. And then I had this gap in my life where I could do whatever I wanted, and I had limited options. I didn't have a driver's license. The nearest town was a 30-minute drive away in rural Montana, and only had about 6,000 people in it. There were no neighbors with kids around us, so I was essentially on my own in a pre-internet era. No smartphones, no iPads, nothing like that. And I read. I spent a lot of time outside, and eventually got really bored, and I just decided to try to write my own book, or try to write a story that I would enjoy reading myself. That was the key. And yes, my parents worked from home, and we're all very close friends, so it was a good relationship there, and I didn't feel like I couldn't show them my work. And I never felt like the feedback they were giving me was, malicious or anything but well-intentioned. So even when it was difficult to look at it and go, "Oh boy, this is a lot of editing. I don't know how I feel about this," I knew it was coming from a supportive place in their case, and that helped.
Oh, that's so important. I think we've all had the parents giving the editing feedback before and
Hmm.
going, "Oh my God, it's so much." Even when it comes from a good place.
Just wait till you write a sex scene, and then your parents are going to have to read it.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh no.
Hopefully, gotta hide it.
I'm a fully grown adult man, and it still makes me nervous when my parents read my books.
Oh, I can't imagine. I'm in a similar boat right now to where you were, where I've just graduated early
Mm.
too, and I'm kind of going, well, what am I supposed to do now? So I'm.
It's scary. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Graduate. It's
Oh
a
yeah.
classic Dustin Hoffman film for those who haven't seen it, and it hit me really hard. I saw it at 16, I want to say, and it perfectly captured that sense of displacement. I think that so many folks experience when you're between high school and college, or you're between college and like an actual job and adult life. And it can be really scary to be in that position and trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What is worthy of me devoting my life to, in a sense? And sometimes it's a very practical answer. It's survival. It's like, I got to get whatever job I can to put food on the table and keep a roof over my head. And there's no shame in that. That's part of why my family and I did self-publish, and I was willing to do what us introverted author reader types hate to do, which is go stand in front of people and talk to them. The reason I was willing to do that was because books sold literally was food on the table in a very tangible sense back then. And without that pressure, I don't think I would have pushed myself to do what was otherwise very uncomfortable.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I fully get that. So going way back to something that you mentioned earlier, that your day to day looks very similar to most writers. Could you share a little bit about what that day to day with writing is?
It depends where I am in the process. So if I'm writing a first draft, then I'm in a nice, relaxed, happy state. I get to have a schedule. I get to exercise when I want to exercise, spend time with my kids, my wife, answer emails, whatever. So usually in that case, I get up in the morning, have breakfast with my kids and my wife. I maybe will go outside for a walk with my son, something like that. Then I'll sit at the computer. I will answer emails, attempt to read the entire internet, which always fails. And then once my brain is working, I'll actually start writing, and I'll write pretty consistently until mid to late afternoon, usually late afternoon, and then I'll go exercise, and then it's dinner time and family time and all of that. And if I feel like it, I'll write in the evenings, but often that's just personal family time. Uh, if I am up against deadlines, which is where I am at the moment because I lost 2 weeks touring for Fractal Noise when I was right in the middle of my copy editing cycle for Murtagh, then it's just basically get up in the morning, grab breakfast, sit at the computer, button seat all day as long as possible, basically just work as much as possible. And as soon as my brain starts getting burned out, I get up, I do something physical for a couple of minutes, and then it's back on the computer. And usually that just runs until 10:30, 11 at night, and then I pass out and do it again the next day.
Do you have any tips for avoiding that burnout during those times with deadlines looming and everything?
I mean, the first piece of advice is don't get in this situation. But sometimes it's unavoidable. Life stuff happens, and sometimes you just end up with that sort of a deadline. The main thing, I think, is finding ways to maintain your motivation. So if you can see the end of the tunnel, if you know how many days you have left and how much work you have left, and you can really just focus for a couple of weeks, great. But the main thing is just keeping in mind why this is important to you, why the discomfort is worth enduring, and then you just embrace the suck and do it.
That's awesome. Oh, great advice.
And if you do get burned out, don't sit there spinning your wheels. I mean, that's why I said I'll get up, leave the computer, go do something else on the spot. Don't wait and wait and wait until it gets really bad.
Oh, from personal experience, it always makes it so much worse than trying to get back into it if you're just pushing, pushing, pushing at the same thing.
Yeah, it's and that's partly why I don't write multiple projects at once, because I find I can't switch lanes very easily from one story to the next. I really need to be in one book for a long time, and then when it's done, it's done.
Yeah, actually, I want to talk a bit about that. Working in these two very different worlds, what's it like going back and forth? Seeing as, especially now, you're publishing two books in 1 year.
Yeah. Well, it was tricky for Fractal Noise and Murtagh because I had started the editing on Fractal Noise late-ish last year, and then Fractal Noise got dumped on my lap. Editing for Fractal Noise got dumped on my lap, and it had to be done because Fractal Noise was publishing first. So I had to stop working on Murtagh, go back to Fractal Noise, and I wrote the first draft of Fractal Noise all the way back in 2013. So to keep going back to it, and it's a pretty intense and kind of grim story in a few places. So to keep putting my head back into that space was a little jarring. But that said, as a whole, I love going back and forth between two different universes, two different worlds, because it provides variety. I find it incredibly refreshing. And I love the world of Eragon. I'm going to write much more in this world, but I also love the Fractalverse. And so having two completely different things tonally does a lot for me, and I find that doing new things gives me tools and experience that I don't get a chance to acquire otherwise. So I do think my writing in Murtagh is much stronger than it was prior to, say, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars.
Yeah, that makes sense because then you're able to explore like a diverse range of genres, and then you can bring what you learned from and into the one that you've been
And that's
working
one of the
in.
great things with speculative fiction. I mean, science fiction, you can write any kind of story in a sci-fi setting, and same for fantasy. So it's if you have to be pigeonholed in one or two genres, those are like the best ever, because oh, you're writing a romance story, but there's a dragon in it, or you're on a spaceship or whatever. You could do that with a detective novel or historical fiction, and that's That's a lot of fun. That's the flexibility is welcome.
Well, then, if they could not be classified as sci-fi or fantasy, what would you classify your books as?
Oh, they are. I mean, they are sci-fi and fantasy.
But if that was like if those labels were not there and you had to, because as you're saying, they could be romance with an inner detective or horror or anything.
That's a really interesting question. In all the interviews over all the years I've done, no one's asked me that question before. I like it. I think the inheritance cycle would fall firmly in the tradition of epic, heroic adventures. Maybe even you could classify it as a saga because it is really kind of a family saga in a couple of ways. But it's heroic fiction in a very traditional romantic sense. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is more of a epic adventure versus like a traditional heroic story, although I think the main character is still very heroic. And then Fractal Noise would be more like a thriller, Lovecraftian polar expedition. So if you've ever read like some of those books of those doomed polar expeditions, the Fractal Noise kind of plays in that space also.
Oh, that sounds incredible. Yeah, well, I'm familiar with this with my own writing, and I've heard other people say it before, where it's like, oh yes, it's packaged as this, but what they really wrote was a ghost story, not a romance, or they really wrote like there's so many different
and
layers.
When you study story structure enough, at least I find I stop seeing the trappings as much, and I'm things become much more symbolic in a sense. And so you're right. You look at something and you go, well, it's a Western in space, or it's a ghost story, or it's this or that. And it can be helpful when you're writing a story to have that understanding of what it is on a very deep level, even if ostensibly it's sci-fi, fantasy, or horror, or whatever.
Definitely. And a lot of times genres, people get so stuck into them, like when they're trying to write, that it can be hard to write.
Not just writing, also reading. And this is something you have to keep in mind as an author. You're making certain promises to the reader with a genre. And if you don't fulfill those promises, people might say, well, it was a really good book, but it's not what I was looking for in XYZ genre.
Oh, and I feel like I've seen that a lot too with the internet and like these book communities where they'll have specific tropes and specific genres and stuff. And then if the book is not exactly in with all of the minutia, then they're like, oh, this was terrible. It was not what I expected at all.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely seen a little bit of that with Fractal Noise because it's different from my previous books. And although it's science fiction, the actual story, like what it's actually about, has nothing to do with science fiction. So if you're okay with that as a reader, I think you'll hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm doing. But if not, if you're looking at it strictly as a sci-fi story, then you might end up gritting your teeth a bit and saying, what's Christopher doing here? I'm not sure if this is what I signed up for.
I think sometimes books like that can make you a stronger reader, though, at least in my personal experience, when I've read things that weren't exactly what I expected it to be based on how it was marketed or the cover looked like or anything. Those have been the things that have like really opened up reading for me and opened up like these other worlds and introduced me to genres I never would have looked at.
One of the fun things I found with reading fantasy is that it actually made it really easy for me to transition to reading historical fiction and books that were written in the past. Because reading something like Anna Karenina or War and Peace or Dostoevsky, you got all these strange places and strange names, and the culture and the society is completely different. And it's like reading a fantasy novel for if you're a kid who was homeschooled in Montana in the 20th century. So fantasy in some ways actually I think it trains you to be a good reader.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because we were actually talking about this a little bit before the interview started, but I read pretty much exclusively fantasy for a period of my life. And after starting up this podcast, I've read much more widely. And throughout that, I feel like I've been able to dive into more genres easily. And just kind of fall into worlds when I was reading at such a rapid pace because I was used to it already.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that makes total sense.
kind of a different question, but are there any books that you've read that were so good that they changed your writing?
Ooh. Um,
I know it's a tricky one.
yeah, that is a tricky one. Um, I read Blood Meridian recently by Cormac McCarthy, and I'm still trying to decide whether I actually like it or not.
Those are the
But
best kind of books.
yeah, I have a very conflicted response to his writing. But that said, there are passages of his. There's one in particular in Blood Meridian that really struck me. He's describing this tree that's been struck by lightning, if I remember this correctly. I read this while sleep deprived with a newborn, so which is probably the worst way ever to read Blood Meridian if you know anything about the plot or the story. But the main character is being sort of chased through the desert and is trekking through endless wilderness and ends up during the nighttime finding this tree that's been struck by lightning and is burning in the desert. And all these animals and insects and reptiles have come in this great circle around this flaming tree. It is an absolutely staggering piece of writing. And it sort of lives rent free in my head. So yeah, beautiful writing, powerful writing will it has definitely had an effect on me more than once. I'd say the writing in the Gormenghast trilogy by Mervyn Peake, The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, which is actually written in faux Jacobean English. Some of the things that Ursula K. Le Guin does in her writing. And poetry too, on occasion. So
You mentioned having like kind of divided opinions. Are there any other times when you've been reading that's come up and changed your writing or the way that you read for the better? Or because sometimes
yes,
that's
but
important too, but
but you have to understand that the sci-fi fantasy community is a rather small one. So I'd rather not name names here. There have been a couple
oh,
of times
of course.
I've read books and I've disliked what was being done in the book so strongly that it's actually like I've done the opposite as a reaction in my own writing. So that happens too sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so when did you start writing? I know we've talked a lot about when you started writing Aragon and everything, but
Mm.
like what interested you about it to begin with? Did you write as a kid at all?
Yeah, I mean, my mom always had me doing like little booklets as projects growing up. So if I were interested in the Egyptian pyramids, we'd go to the library and rent books on that, and then she'd have me do a little like construction paper booklet where I'd write about the pyramids and put it together. So I think it was like perfect training to be an author.
Mhm.
I started writing sort of short stories before I got into high school. And then when I got into high school, my sister and I used an accredited distance learning school called American School. So it's accredited, so you get a high school diploma just like if you went through a regular school. A lot of people who traveled and like celebrities and diplomats use schools like this. So at that point, my parents kind of took their hands off and said, you got to take the tests yourself. You got to do this yourself. We can't do the work for you. Have at it. Which was difficult at first, but it was really useful because I ended up learning how to teach myself. But a side effect of that coursework is that I didn't do any creative writing of my own for a couple of years, working through that, the high school material, because I was just focused on getting those tests done, reading the material, getting the next test done, which is kind of a sad commentary on education right there, isn't it?
Yeah, truly.
Even while being homeschooled, as soon as I started doing any sort of formal, guided education, it just killed the writing. As soon
Mhm.
as and I really started looking forward to finishing that and then writing something myself. And as soon as I did finish the last course, which was Algebra 2, I think, something like that, I started writing again. And it was just adventure stories. It was very much more like Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of stuff, young guy gets dropped off in a jungle somewhere and has to survive, or a superhero story or something like that. But I never wrote anything longer than 5 to 6 pages max, because I never had a complete story. All I ever had were story inciting incidences, or setups for what could be a story, but I never had the actual story. And the first time I really put the effort into constructing a story, I was actually able then to write a finished work, and that work was Eragon.
That is fantastic. Thank you for coming on today and sharing your story and telling all about Fractal Noise and everything. This has been excellent.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
I just have one last question, and that's, what do you have coming up?
As I mentioned,
I know a lot.
Yeah, Murtagh is coming out November 7th. Also on November 7th, we're releasing the 20th anniversary edition of Eragon, which is like this coffee table sized book, and it's got the text in 2 columns, and the whole thing is color, and it has over 50 paintings and illustrations all in color throughout the whole book. That's incredible. Gorgeous. And I'm going to be going on tour for Murtagh. I'll be touring in the United States for a couple of weeks, and possibly up into Canada a little bit, and then over to the UK and Europe. After that, I'm also working on Disney Plus is working on a television adaptation of Eragon. So I'm producing and co-writing that, and we also have a television version of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars that we're trying to get off the ground also. So lots that's keeping me busy, and I'm looking forward to, after Murtagh's edits are done, returning to the Fractalverse and writing another story. The next one might actually be kind of different again. I have this YA steampunk that I want to do. There's a Zeppelin involved, and it is in the Fractalverse. It ties in with everything, but yeah, there's a Zeppelin.
So exciting.
So we'll see.
Well, hopefully that gets made into something, and if it doesn't, I'm sure something equally exciting will come along. Once again, thank you for coming on here. This has been excellent.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Christopher Paolini.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after, the end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast, and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.